Thank you to everyone for being here today. I would like to introduce Rabbi Garth Silberstein. He is currently the rabbi of Base Abraham. Rabbi Silberstein holds a BA in acting and biology from Bennington College. An outdoor enthusiast with an interest in food and agriculture, Rabbi Silberstein is the perfect person to discuss the hidden meanings and messages behind the ritual foods of the Passover Seder. We're so excited to welcome him today with Passover around the corner. And because of his knowledge with hands-on sustainable agriculture, he's going to tell us all about the meanings behind the foods that we eat at our Passover Seder. So welcome, Rabbi Silberstein, and I will continue to add people in as they come. We've got a full house today, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining. It's always a nice treat to get to teach these Mirowitz Center classes, and I was originally talked about set this class up with Steve Cohen, who's no longer here in St. Louis, and I'm very excited to be working with Susan. But of course, I will miss my friend Steve, and I wish him I wish him and Nadine well and all the best in their new life in Israel. So we've been on a little bit of a journey, all of us, since we started talking about this class. And I am particularly excited about teaching about the secrets of the Seder plate, because the Pesach Seder is not only is this a holiday that many Jews around the world who might do nothing else Jewish all year long get very enthusiastic about Passover and have a familiarity with the Passover Seder, even if other aspects of Jewish tradition might be unfamiliar to them. But for myself, as someone who did not grow up thinking I was going to become a rabbi, I didn't grow up Orthodox. I'm an Orthodox rabbi today, but and I didn't grow up doing a lot of traditional Jewish stuff. We have Friday night dinner in my family every week. But that was about it, other than the Passover Seder. And for many years when I was a young person, the Passover Seder was the one time that I really got to not only participate in Jewish ritual life, but lead a Jewish ritual, which is, I think, true for many people. That this is the one time we step out of our role as passive or participants and into an active role of leadership in Jewish ritual life. And I always knew when I led Seders when I was younger, and I didn't necessarily know a lot about where some of the rituals came from, but our Seders, we would always start by doing a tour of the Seder plate. And you can see the Seder plate behind me, and we would talk about all the different items on the Seder plate. And I realized over time that what I knew about these items could be summed up in less than a sentence each. And what their real significance was, or how they got onto the Seder plate, or why we arrange the Seder plate in the specific way that we do, I didn't know anything about. And I wanted to learn more. And so I'm very excited to teach this class for other people who might have been leading Seders as I did for years without really feeling like they understand some of the deeper layers of meaning to what's on the Seder plate. Now I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And here we go. So here's the Seder plate, or a version of the Seder plate. And this is from the Maxwell House Haggadah, and not the classic Maxwell House Haggadah. I guess whatever one you grew up with is the classic Maxwell House Haggadah. This is from the 2011 edition. So And there's different versions of how we set up the Seder plate. So there's items on here that look unfamiliar, or it seems like there's too many items on the Seder plate. Don't worry. There are other versions, and other different communities and different regions have different versions of how they do the Seder plate. This is actually not correct, this footnote that I have there. This is not according to the Ramah of Moshe Isserles, who was in Poland in the 16th century. This is actually according to the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who is one of the preeminent mystics and teachers of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism in the land of Israel, and so this is his Seder plate, and we'll talk about why he arranged all the items the way he arranged them on the Seder plate, and why the people who follow his traditions arrange the items this way. But I want to begin by going through each item and talking about what it is and why it's there. So there's three things that are not pictured here that are part of the Seder plate, or at least belong on the Seder table. And those are the three matzot, the three matzahs. So there's three matzahs, and then we have, starting on the upper right here, we have the zeroa, the shank bone, the beitza, the egg. In the middle, in the middle there, we have the maror, which in this case is represented by horseradish. We'll talk about what the proper species for maror is later on. And then on the bottom right, we have carosis. The bottom left, we have karpas, in this case, parsley. And in the very bottom center, we have chazeres, or lettuce. And let's do I want to go through this item by item and talk about what each one does. So let's start with the matzah. There are three matzahs on the Seder plate. And this is not a rhetorical question. I'm asking the group, if anyone can tell me why we have three matzahs at the Seder. Why not just one? So the Torah says that we have to eat matzah at the Seder. We have to eat matzah at Passover, but it doesn't say anything about eating three matzahs. Why do we put three matzahs on the Passover Seder table? And feel free to unmute yourselves and chime in, or you could type something into the chat if you would rather do it that way. I'm for some reason not seeing the chat.
There should be at the bottom something that says chat with a
I see it here.
You click on that. And Cindy said we break the middle one, so there have to be three.
Okay, great. So Cindy is ahead of the game here. So Cindy says we break the middle one, so there have to be three. Well, let's come back to that. Did anyone ever hear any other explanations of why there are three? Alan says he also believes it has to do with breaking the middle matzah. So yeah, you're correct that it has to do with breaking the middle matzah. Anybody else have ever heard any other explanations of why three matzahs? So that's great. I grew up with a Haggadah that said we had three matzahs to correspond to three groupings of the Jewish people: the Kohanim, the priests, the Leviim, the Levites, and Yisraelim, all the other Jews. I don't know why the Haggadah I grew up with said that. I grew up thinking that's why there were three matzahs. But that's not that's maybe a nice drush, a nice little gloss on why there's three matzahs. That's not the real reason. The real reason is what Cindy and Alan are alluding to, and it has to do with, oh dear, this is not lined up. Okay. So I'm going to have to do this not as I didn't realize how little of my screen was shared. Okay, let me just, here we go. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the matzahs. We read about the matzahs. So Rav Papa said you said that it has to do with breaking the middle matzah, and we read in the Talmud Bavli there's a discussion about whether we should, when we make a blessing over bread, we should bless over the whole loaf before tearing the loaf or slicing the loaf into pieces. And this is not by Passover, this is by all year round. And there's a debate about whether it's better to make the blessing over a little piece of bread that you're about to pop into your mouth or a whole loaf of bread, because that's a nice whole thing. And that debate has to do with why some people have the custom on Shabbat of making a little slice in a loaf of bread before they make the blessing over bread on Shabbat, because then that way it's sort of sliced, but it's also still whole. And so you can satisfy both those opinions. And in that discussion, Rav Papa says, everyone agrees that, I might not, hold on. Can you see my screen here?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, I'm just trying to zoom in. Okay, so Rav Papa says, everyone agrees that on Passover, you put a broken piece of bread, already broken piece of bread, and in this case, the bread is matzah, not yeast bread, within a whole loaf, and you make the blessing. And the question is, why do we have to make a blessing over broken matzah as opposed to the whole matzah? And that has to do with the verse in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, that refers to matzah as lechem oni, the bread of affliction, or sometimes this is translated as the bread of poverty, the bread of the poor. And the Rashi explains, poor people don't eat a whole loaf of bread at one meal. They break off a little piece to savor what little they have. And so on Passover, when we eat the bread of poverty, the bread of affliction, we have to make, unlike the rest of the year when we would prefer to make a blessing over a whole loaf, on Passover we make a blessing over a broken piece. So that tells me why I need the middle broken loaf, middle broken matzah. But what about the other two matzahs? Why do I need that? That tells me why I need one broken matzah. Why do I need two more matzahs? And the answer to that question is a general principle that we learn that Rabbi Abba says on Shabbat, a person is obligated to make the blessing over bread using two whole loaves of bread. So on the Shabbat table, where the ideal is to have 2 loaves of bread on the Shabbat table that are unbroken when we make the blessing over bread. And that has to do with the fact that in the desert, when we were traveling in the desert, on Fridays, we got a double portion of manna, and the Torah refers to that as lechem mishneh, a double portion of bread. And so since in the desert with the manna, we had a double portion of bread, then on Friday night, and by extension at all our Shabbat and holiday meals, we eat we eat 2 whole loaves of bread as a memory, a commemoration of the double portion of manna in the desert. And since the first day of Passover is a holiday and it's referred to as a Shabbat, a kind of Sabbath, we want 2 whole loaves at the Seder table. But since we have an opinion that we need 2 whole loaves, and we have an opinion that we need to make the blessing on a broken loaf, so what do? We put 3 loaves on the table, 3 matzahs, we break one, and we still have our 2 whole ones left over. So we can satisfy the opinion of Rav Papa, who says we need to make the blessing over a broken loaf, and we can satisfy the opinion of Rabbi Abba, who says we need to make it over 2 whole loaves. And now in this way, we satisfy all opinions. Okay. So why is it, so important to eat matzah on Passover in the first place? The Torah commands us to eat matzah on Passover. Why do we eat matzah on Passover? This is not a trick question. Can anyone tell me, why do we eat matzah on Passover? Really not a trick question.
Because the Jews left Egypt in such a hurry, they didn't have time to let the bread rise. Okay, so we left in such a hurry that we didn't have time to let the bread rise. And they put the bread, so has anyone ever wondered about that? What kind of an explanation that is? I mean, I always wondered about this growing up. Bread does not take that long to rise. Couldn't the bread have risen while they were hiking from Egypt to wherever they were camping the first night? And by the time they got there, the bread would have risen? Anyone ever wonder that?
Not really, but I'm not a cook, but wouldn't you, even if the yeast rises, the dough rises, don't you have to bake it? I guess they may not have had ovens to bake it.
Okay, so maybe they didn't have ovens to bake it. So that's interesting. You're right. They wouldn't have had, I never thought of that they wouldn't have had ovens to bake it with. Although a campfire, you can, you use a campfire, you heat up some rocks and slap the dough on a rock, it'll bake pretty good on your campfire. But you're right. They wouldn't have had the whatever kitchen appliances they had in Egypt. And this but the hold on a second. So the truth is that bread doesn't take a long time to rise nowadays, because we live in a post-Pasteur world where we know about things like microorganisms, including yeast. And you can go to the supermarket and buy yourself a package of yeast, and you throw its little microbes ready to go, start gobbling up the sugars in your flour and turning them into carbon dioxide, which is going to leaven the bread, and it works really fast. That's why we have Fleischmann's fast-acting yeast, because in a world before Pasteur, the only way to make leavened bread was to put flour and water together and wait for some yeast that was in the air or maybe in the mixing bowl that you had to colonize the dough and turn it into sourdough. I mean, you would have something called, what we would now call a sourdough starter. You'd mix some pre-fermented dough with the other dough to get it to rise. But even with that, it could take quite a long time. And therefore, to make really good fluffy bread would have been a process of 24 hours or more of rising. But by the time you kneaded and waited for the bread to rise, it could have taken all day long. So that's why we have matzah at the Seder plate, and that's why we have 3 matzahs. And I'll also note one more thing about matzah, is that bread was invented. 2 key types of chametz that we don't eat on Passover, bread and beer, were both invented in Egypt. So by refraining from eating leavened bread, we are refraining from one of the great cultural and technological innovations that Egypt brought to human civilization. And so matzah is not only commemoration of our ancestors getting out of town in a hurry, it's also a repudiation of Egyptian culture. because Egypt was built on bread. Okay, so let's get back to the Seder plate. That was the matzah, which is off to the side, or maybe it's in a 3-layer stack underneath this Seder plate. But what about the other items on the Seder plate? Where do they come from? So I want to start with the karpas. So this Seder plate has parsley as the karpas. Anybody else use something different for their karpas at their Seders?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
Steve Lefrak. I'm sorry, I had trouble with my electronics, but so I'm a little back to matzah. Just I have a couple of questions. I thought we only had to eat matzah on the 2 nights of the Seders. During the rest of Passover, as long as you didn't eat unleavened bread, you didn't have to eat matzah.
That is correct.
And matzah, just an answer to why it has to rise. I mean, we ate matzah as slaves because we were slaves. It was flat bread. It wasn't as fancy as what the Egyptians ate, nor do we have time to let it rise. But the point is that I thought that bread has to, matzah, flour has to go from the bread of affliction to the bread of this transformation to the bread of freedom. And so matzah changes throughout the Passover, throughout the Haggadah, from slavery to that. And so you got to give it time to do that transformation.
Right. So there's not a physical transformation, but there is a spiritual or metaphysical transformation, a transformation of identity. And it's true that matzah is referred to as both the bread of affliction and as the bread of freedom. Now, it's not referred to as the bread of slavery, which is key, because slavery and freedom are incompatible, but poverty and freedom are not incompatible. And in fact, our slavery in Egypt was not necessarily a slavery of poverty. Some Jews in Egypt were poor. Other Jews we know were wealthy and comfortable and even owned other Jews as slaves, which was why one of the commandments we got before we could leave Egypt was the Jews had to free their own slaves before they could be liberated from Egypt. So the Egyptian servitude wasn't necessarily one of poverty for everyone, but it was one of affliction for everyone. You can have servitude that comes with material comfort. Think about the first, the lawyer right out of law school who might be making 6 figures, but they're working 100 hours a week. And their condition might be one of material comfort, but it's hard to say it's also not one of servitude at the same time. That you can have you can have servitude and material comfort simultaneously, but you just as you can have freedom and poverty simultaneously. So the bread of poverty or the bread of affliction becomes the bread of freedom. And we have to be, if we're not willing to endure a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of owning, of affliction, we're not going to get to the point where we can have the bread of freedom. So thank you for adding that. Okay, so karpa. So I always grew up with parsley as the karpas. I know other people have a custom, especially people whose families more recently came from places where you can't get green vegetables this time of year, use potatoes for their karpas. I know one family that does French fries with ketchup, dipped in ketchup for their karpas. Little idea for your Seder at home. But where does this idea of karpas come from? So it actually the idea of karpas is very old. It goes back to the Mishnah, which is, we're going to be looking at the Mishnah a lot today. The Mishnah is a 2nd century compilation of Jewish law, the really original thematic authoritative compilation of Jewish law, which was edited in the year 200, we believe. And then in the last chapter of the Mishnah tractate Psachim, which deals with Passover, it talks about the Seder. The first 9 chapters mostly just deal with the laws of the Passover sacrifice, which aren't so applicable for us today. And then there's one chapter that talks about the Seder. And it says they serve him. So they're imagining that everybody has, has a wait staff at their Seder who comes and serves them the plate, the Seder plate or a plate. And it says they dip lettuce. Doesn't say what they dip it in, but they dip lettuce. And up until the point where they reach the accompaniment for the bread. So the accompaniment for the bread presumably refers to all the stuff we're going to eat with our matzah. The Carosis, the maror, if you're in the time of the temple, the Passover sacrifice itself, all the other foods you're going to have with your meal. Until you get to that point, you're dipping lettuce in something and noshing on it. Now, the question is, why? We all start our Seders this way with dipping, in our case, parsley, not lettuce. So the first question is, why does it start this way? Anyone have ever hear anything about the significance of the karpas or why we start the meal that way? Harriet, yeah.
I don't know if I'm muted. Do you hear me?
We hear you, yeah.
I always thought it was the bitter tears, crying because of the situation.
So the custom nowadays is to dip whatever you're using for karpas, whether it's lettuce or parsley or boiled potato, to dip it in salt water. And you're right that salt water connotes the tears that we cried during slavery. Now, but the karpas itself, any idea, anyone hear anything about why we start with karpas? So I always was told we eat karpas because we eat parsley because it's something green to remind, because this is ultimately, in addition to being a holiday that celebrates our liberation from Egypt, it's also a holiday that celebrates the spring, the beginning of spring. And therefore we eat something green to remind us of the rebirth of that's happening in nature, which parallels our own liberation from Egypt, which I think is true. But that's not the only or even the primary reason for karpas. So Rav Avadia Bar Tanura, who was a Spanish commentator on the Mishnah, says, first of all, it doesn't have to be lettuce. Good. So we're not doing anything wrong. Those of us who are eating parsley or potatoes or French fries. He says they serve them vegetables so that children will notice and ask. For it is not the norm to serve vegetables before the meal. Right? The normal way we have a meal is, if it's a holiday meal, we make kiddush over wine, and then we serve the bread, and then we have you have your soup, you have your gefilte fish, you have your meal. And here on Passover, we start, instead of going straight from the kiddush wine to the bread, we take a detour into, we go back from kiddush, and now we're back to hors d'oeuvres. And we're having vegetables, because that's not how we normally do our meals. And the idea here is to pique the curiosity of children at the table to recognize that something unusual is going on. So this is the rabbi's pedagogical genius at work here. The rabbis understood that something you just tell your children will not be absorbed or internalized in the same way that they absorb something that they arrive at with their own curiosity. So rather than just sitting down at the table and saying, now we're going to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, we sit down at the table and we do things in an unusual manner to get the kids to say, what's going on here? Why are we eating this parsley? So it's a little bit circular. Why do we eat the parsley? To get you to ask why we eat the parsley. And once you ask why we eat the parsley, then we actually can start the Haggadah. We can start telling the story because we've piqued your curiosity enough to ask the question. And the Bar Tanura also adds, it doesn't have to be specifically lettuce. It could be any other vegetables. but lettuce is going to come in later in the Seder. And the Mishnah is just letting us know that if you don't have any other vegetables, you can use the same lettuce that you're going to use later in the Seder. Okay, so that was the karpas. What about the rest of the Seder plate? That's one item down, 5 items here on the Arizal Seder plate to go. All of these items, perhaps, except for one, are mentioned in the same Mishnah that the continuation of the same Mishnah. So after they bring him karpas, they serve him and he dips the lettuce. Then it says they serve him matzah, lettuce, and Carosis, and 2 cooked dishes, even though Carosis is not a mitzvah. Okay, and then Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says no, Carosis is a mitzvah. Carosis is a mitzvah unto itself, and then we add that when the temple stood, they would also serve the Passover sacrifice at this point. So here we have the whole Seder plate, I think. Matzah, lettuce, Carosis, and 2 cooked dishes. So we talked about the matzah, we talked about the karpas, and now we have lettuce. That's chazeres down here, Carosis. 2 cooked dishes, which maybe that's we can say are the lamb shank and the egg. Are we missing anything here? Is there anything on our Seder plate that's missing from this list? Matzah, lettuce, Carosis, and 2 cooked dishes. Something very central is missing. Harriet, yeah. You're still muted.
Egg.
Go ahead.
Okay, so it doesn't mention egg, although egg I'm going to call a cooked dish. We'll get to the cooked dishes in a minute. I'm going to just call egg a cooked dish. It's cooked, but yeah, it doesn't specifically mention egg. It also doesn't specifically mention a shank bone, but let's assume those are 2 cooked dishes. The other thing it doesn't mention is maror.
Oh, right.
Say anything about maror.
Right.
Now, why doesn't it mention maror? So I was just before we get to what do people use for maror on their Seder plate? What do you use for the bitter herbs on your Seder plate? Feel free to put in the chat or just shout it out. No need to raise your hand.
Horseradish.
Horseradish, right? Like every good Ashkenazi American Jew, I grew up eating horseradish at the Seder. And it's, there's a little bit of a macho contest. How can you eat that kazait, that olive-sized dollop of horseradish without losing your head? Now, I always had this nagging thought in my mind, which is horseradish. It's spicy, but it's not bitter, right? So I always thought it was a little curious that that's the bitter herb. It's definitely something. It's not the most pleasant thing to stuff in your mouth all at once, but bitter is not the word I would use for horseradish. And what's interesting is horseradish, as far as we know, was not known in the land of Israel in the times of the Bible or in the times of the rabbis. So horseradish is a later custom. And in fact, the Mishnah mentions 5 possible things that we can use for the that we can use for maror, and we're pretty sure what 4 of them are. And one of them we're pretty sure is something that we just don't have anymore, and none of them are horseradish. So the Mishnah in Pesachim says, these are the vegetables you can fulfill your obligation for maror with: lettuce, chazeres, tamcha, which we don't know what it is. It's identified with a Greek vegetable that started with a G that we don't really have any documentation of what it is more recent than over 1,000 years ago. but it's described as a purple root. So maybe people might think that that was horseradish, although it doesn't really match the description of horseradish. Eringo, which is in Hebrew charchavina, which I actually have a little botanical illustration of what eringo is because I've never heard of it before. This is so here's charchavina. It looks a little bit thistly, but it is. Oh, that's not showing up with my screen share. Okay, I got to turn off my virtual background here. And now you can see that. So this is this here is harchavina. It's in the carrot, celery, parsley type family. It's an umbellifer, and then we have chicory, which is sometimes ulshin, and something called sonchus, which is in Hebrew what we think the literal word maror means in Hebrew. But none of those things are sonchus. Here's sonchus. It's sort of a lettucey looking thing. None of those things are horseradish. So where does the custom of eating horseradish come from? It probably comes from the same place as using a potato for karpas, which is in Poland and Russia and Lithuania, you don't have fresh leafy greens of any kind at this time of year. So you don't have access to lettuce in April. So so you had to come up with something to make do. And so our ancestors came up with, okay, we'll use horseradish. But the lettuce is actually a much more proper maror than horseradish. And in fact, the Arizal Seder plate has a space for maror and a space for chazeres, for lettuce. And we'll talk about why we have two in a minute. But some people put horseradish in the space for maror, and they put lettuce in the space for chazeres because they can't let go of their Ashkenazi ancestors' custom of using horseradish, even though we now have access to the real maror, which is lettuce. Whereas the Arizal probably just had lettuce in both spots. Some Sephardim use two different species from the list in the Mishnah in those two spots. They'll put chicory or endive, which some people think is will identify as ulshin, and in the maror spot, and they'll put lettuce in the lettuce spot. Now, why two spaces for maror? So there's a Kabbalistic reason which we'll get to, I hope. But there's also two times we eat maror at the Seder. We eat maror once by itself, dipped in Carosis, and then we eat it once together with matzah. And so the idea is that you take the maror from the maror spot when you're going to do the mitzvah of eating maror by itself, and then you'll take the chazeres from the lettuce spot when it's time to eat the maror together with the matzah. Now it's interesting. The word chazeres means lettuce, but it also looks a lot like within it the Hebrew root chet zayin resh, which means to repeat or to go back. So we use the chazeres when we're repeating eating maror for a second time. Okay, so we've talked about karpas, we've talked about maror and chazeres. Now let's talk about the zroa and the beitza. And you were right, Harriet, when you mentioned that the egg was not mentioned in the list of things on the Seder plate, but the list does include two cooked dishes. And in fact, both a bone and an egg are mentioned as possibilities for fulfilling these cooked dishes. So first of all, any vegetarians in the group? Anyone ever not want meat on their Seder plate? So I always, I have a lot of I'm from California, so I know a lot of vegetarians. And the thing they always say is if you're vegetarian, you could put a beet on the Seder plate instead of the shank bone. And I never understood why a beet. Maybe because it's like red and bloody like a piece of meat. But the beet actually has its origin in the Talmud. The Talmud says, "My shnei tavshilin." What are the two cooked foods that we should have on the Seder plate? And Rav Huna says, beets and rice. Now, this might shock some of us who don't eat rice on Passover, but the idea that we should not, the idea of not eating rice on Passover was not a universal custom by any means in the time of the Talmud. There were some people who thought rice might actually be chametz, which we don't think nowadays. But there wasn't this concept of avoiding rice and legumes and such yet. That wouldn't come along for another 1,000 years, that custom. But Rav Huna says, Rav Huna said you can have beets and rice. Doesn't need to be anything fancy. You don't need, roast lamb. You don't need gefilte fish. Your two cooked dishes could be beets and rice. That's a sufficient Passover meal. And Rav Huna was just saying, like, beets and rice to let you know it doesn't have to be anything special. But his student, Rava, would go out of his way to get beets and rice because his teacher, Rav Huna, said beets and rice. And even though he knew his teacher was only giving beets and rice as an example, since his teacher said beets and rice, the rest of his life, he went out of his way to get beets and rice for his Seder plate to follow his teacher's teaching. So when we those who put a beet on the Seder plate are actually fulfilling the practice of Rav Huna and Rava. Now, what about that egg? So the egg also is mentioned in the Talmud. Chizkiah says you could have fish with egg on it, and that would count. It might be one thing. You batter a fish with egg and cook it. That counts as two cooked dishes. You got the fish and you got the egg. And so that's the egg is mentioned. And then Rav Yosef replies, you need two kinds of meat. One for the Passover sacrifice and one in memory of the festival sacrifice, what's called the Korban Chagiga, which they would use in case you had more people than you had, too many people to fill up with the Passover sacrifice. You would bring an extra sacrifice and include that in your meal so everyone would have plenty to eat. And then Ravina says you could even use just a bone with the sauce that it was cooked in. So you use a bone to make a gravy, and that bone together with the gravy that you cooked out of it could count as two dishes. Now, so we have the bone and we have the egg. So we sort of split the difference between Chizkiah and Ravina here. Now, why is it called zroa, a shank bone? So this is a reference to the verse that in Deuteronomy when it says, "Vayotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim biyad chazaka v'zroa netuyah." The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. So he specifically used the shank bone because it corresponds to the arm of the sheep, as it were, reminding us that Hashem stretched out his arm to rescue us from Egypt. So we've talked about the bitter herbs, we've talked about the karpas, we talked about the shank bone and the egg. That just leaves the Carosis. This is my favorite one. And checking the time. Okay, great. So what about this Carosis? Now, why do we have the Carosis on the Seder plate? Anyone want to tell me where the idea of Carosis comes from? What does the Carosis mean? Harriet.
I might be wrong on this. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I thought it was the mortar, like bricks.
Right. The mortar. Anybody? I always grew up hearing Carosis was the mortar.
Yeah.
The mortar. Now, here I always feel like and here's again, the mortar is what I think most of us grew up hearing. The Carosis is the mortar, and it makes sense. It's the consistency of mortar. But I always felt like that's what we're commemorating. We don't have anything to commemorate the plague of blood or frogs or the parting of the sea at the Seder. We don't have anything at the Seder commemorating the plague of darkness. We don't have anything commemorating all kinds of other miraculous and heroic aspects of the story. But the mortar that we use to make to build cities for Pharaoh, that we're going to commemorate with its own special dish on the Seder plate. It always struck me as a little strange. But there's actually a second explanation. So there's at least two other explanations for why Carosis. So remember that the Mishnah we read said we serve Carosis even though it's not a mitzvah. And if it's not a mitzvah, then why do we serve it? And Rav Ami said, because of poison. What does that mean? Because of poison. So the idea here is, hold on. Let's get back to our Seder plate. What do we use the Carosis for? We dip the maror in it, or nowadays, most of the time we're scooping it together with the maror, but you eat the maror together with the Carosis. And there's an idea that the bitterness of the maror, whatever chemicals make the maror unpleasant to eat, are counteracted by what's in the Carosis. Whether it's just the fact that it's sweet, or there's something about something chemically going on in the Carosis that counteracts the bitterness of the maror. We need the Carosis simply to counteract the poison or the bitterness of the maror. That's Rav Am. But remember, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, said that Carosis is a mitzvah unto itself. So what is the mitzvah? Rabbi Levi says, in memory of the apple. So it's not I thought it was in memory of mortar, but Rabbi Levi says it's in memory of the apple. We'll talk in a second about what this apple is. But then we get Rabbi Yochanan saying, phew, there's my mortar. Rabbi Yochanan says it's in memory of the mortar. Okay, we're back to mortar. I can relax. And then Abaye said, you know what, we're going to split the difference. I'm not sure if it's apples or mortar that we're commemorating. So we'll make it sour like a nice tart apple, and we'll make it thick like mortar. And that way we can have sour for the apples, thick for the mortar, and everybody's happy. So what is this business of with the mortar? There's also an additional consideration that the Talmud goes on to say that we put spices in it to commemorate the straw that was used when they made bricks with this mortar. And that's why the custom is to make our Carosis always with cinnamon. And some people are careful not to use powdered cinnamon, ground cinnamon, but to crush up whole cinnamon sticks so that you can find little pieces of cinnamon resembling straw in your Carosis. And that commemorates the straw in the mortar. Now, and Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok said, in Jerusalem, it used to be that you could eat shopkeepers who sold spices would, before Passover, entice people to come by, come get yourself spices for the mitzvah. Remember, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, is the one who's telling us it's a mitzvah to use maror. So he's citing as proof. He's citing as proof the practice of Jerusalem's shopkeepers as a proof for his religious principle that this is a mitzvah. Now, I know shopkeepers will say anything to get you to buy their stuff, but for Rabbi Tzadok, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, this was proof enough that it was in fact a mitzvah. The fact that a shopkeeper trying to sell spices would tell you that the spices are a mitzvah, part of a mitzvah. Now, what about this apple? What's the apple that we're commemorating? Any ideas about what the apple that we are commemorating is? So this is, I think, one of the least well-known and most beautiful resonances of the Seder. And the apple that's referred to is a reference to this verse from the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, which is traditionally read at Passover time. And in chapter 8 of the Song of Songs, we read, Mizos olam min hamidbar misrapekas al doda tachas hatapuach orarticha shama chibalta imecha shama chibala yiladetcha. Who is this coming up from the desert, leaning on her beloved? Under the apple I aroused you. There your mother labored with you. There the one who bore you labor. And citing this verse, the Midrash explains that when Pharaoh wanted to destroy the Jewish people, before he decreed that the baby boys should be killed, he first decreed that husbands, when they were working for Pharaoh, couldn't come home to their homes and their families and their wives, and they should sleep out in the fields while they were working for Pharaoh. So, and in doing this, he sought to enforce separations between husbands and wives and reduce the number of Jewish babies that would be born by reduce the number of Jewish babies being born by just reducing the amount of time that husbands and wives could spend together. And what happened? So Rabbi Akiva says that it was the righteous women who heroically stepped up. The men were too defeated by their work to do anything about this. So the women went out and they would go to the river and they would collect water and fish and bring it to the fields where their husbands were working, and they would make them a nice lunch, and they would, after lunch, they would sit down and they would flirt with their husbands and seduce their own husbands out in the fields, in the apple orchards where they were working. And why is it important they were apple orchards? Because among the trees, you could maybe find a little privacy. And then the women would go back there when they were ready to deliver their children, to birth their children, and they would give birth among the apple orchards. Again, presumably because there was privacy there, and the Egyptians who were out looking for Jewish babies to murder wouldn't find you right away. And so we remember the apples with the Carosis. And I think this is very important because it speaks to the heroism of the Israelite women and the sweetness that was part of our response to oppression. The love between spouses, the joy and playfulness that could be, that thanks to the Israelite women were possible even in spite of the Egyptian oppression. And it also speaks to the heroism and bravery of the Jewish women who wanted to keep the Jewish people alive in spite of everything Pharaoh was doing. So the Carosis is within it, it commemorates, on the one hand, the mortar, the labor the men were doing, and on the other hand, the heroics of the Jewish women in perpetuating the Jewish people in spite of these harsh conditions. So I want to just conclude. We have 5 minutes left. And so Maxine asks, why do we make a Hillel sandwich between horseradish, Carosis, and 2 pieces of matzah? So this is a great question, Maxine, and I'm glad you asked. So the Haggadah says that we do this because Hillel would make a sandwich out of, even though there was no more temple in Hillel's time, he would make a sandwich out of horseradish and matzah, even without the Passover sacrifice. He would make a horseradish and matzah sandwich. So where does the Carosis come in? And I think the Carosis, here's a third resonance for Carosis, besides maybe now a fourth, besides just something sweet to counteract the bitterness of the maror, and something commemorating the heroism of Jewish women, and something commemorating the mortar. The Carosis is something that is red, and if you use wine to make your Carosis, which we traditionally do, it's something red and bloody. We stick in a sandwich together with the with the maror and the matzah, and I think the Carosis is a stand-in for the korban, the meat of the Passover sacrifice, which the Torah says you eat the Passover sacrifice with bitter herbs and matzah, and we don't have a Passover sacrifice anymore, and our custom nowadays is we don't even eat roast lamb at the Seder anymore because it looks too much like the Passover sacrifice, but we do eat Carosis as a sort of stand-in for the as a stand-in for the Pesach sacrifice. I want to say one more thing about maror. If this was a more talkative group, I imagine someone would have objected, and some of you were probably thinking when I said that lettuce is preferable maror to horseradish, you would have objected that lettuce is too pleasant to eat. Lettuce isn't bitter, right? Who here was thinking when I said that lettuce is more authentic maror than horseradish? We're thinking, yeah, but it's not bitter enough. I need something really bitter and unpleasant to eat. So this is a chiddush that I learned from Dr. John Greenberg, who is a biblical ethnobotanist, which means he studies how people in the times of the Torah used plants. He's by training, has a PhD in agricultural science, and he teaches at a Jewish day school for a living. But in his hobby is biblical ethnobotany. And he points out, what do we know about lettuce? Lettuce, if you get it from the grocery store, it's not bitter. But if you plant lettuce in your garden and you don't pick it at the right time, and you let the lettuce sit in your garden past the proper time for picking it, it will become increasingly more and more bitter. And the maror gives us a lesson about the nature of the bitterness of the slavery in Egypt, because the bitterness of the slavery in Egypt didn't taste bitter at first. We went to Egypt and it was great. We were starving in the land of Canaan, and in Egypt we had food, and we had privileges as Joseph's family, and it was great. And it was only slowly over time as we lost our rights and privileges, and the Egyptians started slowly imposing more and more measures to oppress us, that our time in Egypt became more and more and more bitter. And there's a lesson here that if we had plucked ourselves up out of Egypt early enough, it would have never gotten so bitter. And that's the lesson that the maror, when we use lettuce, imparts about the bitterness of Egyptian servitude. So so lettuce actually contains this powerful Torah about the way that slavery often starts. It doesn't always start with someone pointing a gun at your head and enslaving you. It very often starts sweetly with someone offering to take care of you. And pretty soon you're beholden, and before you know it, you are enslaved. And over time, it becomes more and more bitter. And so that's connected to the lesson about the matzah being something that we can bake quickly, because to avoid the bitterness of slavery, we have to be prepared to know when it's time to pick up and go. So I'm sorry, Harriet thought I didn't explain about the Hillel Sandwich. So I was saying the Hillel Sandwich is because the Bible says to eat the Passover sacrifice with matzah and bitter herbs. And so we make the Hillel Sandwich is matzah, bitter herbs, and then we put in the Carosis, both because we always have Carosis with our bitter herbs. We never eat the bitter herbs by themselves. And also because the Carosis resembles the meat of the Korban Pesach. And Harvey asks, why do we some put an orange out? So there's some apocryphal story. There's some stories. Some of versions are apocryphal, and I'm not sure which the real version is. But I think people put an orange at this on the Seder plate because of this idea. Someone once said, ask something about the place of. I've heard different versions of the story, whether it's the place of women in Judaism, or women in rabbinic leadership, or the place of LGBT people in the Jewish community. And someone said, women belong in the rabbinate like an orange belongs on the Seder plate. And that was and as a rebuttal to that, some people put an orange on the Seder plate to say that is where women belong. Or for those those who said the other version that it's about the LGBT community, say that it's a rebuttal to that idea that no, these folks do belong in the Jewish community. I've also heard the version that they said that it's like they belong in the rabbinate like a loaf of bread belongs on the Seder plate. And someone wanted to put a loaf of bread on their Seder plate, and they said that's too much. We'll do an orange instead. Now, I think if it's really about the role of women in leadership in the Jewish community, I think the Carosis is already there. The Carosis, which we don't talk about, but let's talk about the heroic women that the Carosis commemorates. And if you want to put a little orange zest in your Carosis, it might not be a bad idea. I wanted to talk about the way the Seder plate corresponds to the Kabbalistic tree of life, of the 10 Sefirot, but I don't have time to get into that. But I'll note that there is a correspondence in the way the Arizal, the Rabbi Luria, arranges his Seder plate, that the 6 items on the Seder plate correspond to the 6 lower Sefirot of divine emanations according to Kabbalah. This may be a little bit beyond what we have time to get into today, but there's actually 10 Sefirot, and we only have 6 items on the Seder plate, but the 3 upper Sefirot are represented by the 3 Matzahs, and the plate itself represents Malchus, the lowest of the 10 Sefirot, for those who are interested in Kabbalistic Sefirot. All right, we are over time, but not as egregiously as last time I taught one of these classes. So if I'm happy to stay on and answer questions if people want to stay on, but we'll conclude things there.
Well, I just want to take a moment to thank you, Rabbi Silberstein. This was fascinating. I learned many things that I didn't know before. And I'm all in for French fries dipped in ketchup for the Carosis now. So, that's going to be on my next Seder plate. I appreciate everybody for being here today. And Passover is just around the corner. Wishing everyone a happy Passover. Thank you again, Rabbi Silberstein. And we will see you next time.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Will we be getting a copy of the transcript or anything?
Well, today was recorded, and so I can certainly send out a copy of the recording for everyone to review. You can share with family and friends.
Thank you, because there was a lot of information, so it would be nice to be able to go back over it. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Did you all know that?
Rabbi, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag Kasher v'Sameach. And as the Satmar Rebbetzin used to tell people, make sure your Chag is not so kasher that it's not Sameach, and it's not so Sameach that it's not kasher. Make sure your Passover is not so kosher that it's not happy, and it's not so happy that it's not kosher.
Did you all know that
Okay.
Collinsville, Illinois is the horseradish capital of the world?
I knew that.
It's just across what's near Edwardsville, not far.
We should make a field trip next year.
Yes, they have a festival. Once a year they have a festival. I'm not sure when it's coming up, but they do celebrate the horseradish. I guess the soil is perfect for growing horseradish, and it's well known for that.
Wow.
Horseradish capital, right in our backyard.
Yeah.
I think we need to organize a field trip next year.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming. Be well.
Thank you, you too.